of something that happened in 1996. I'll just see if I can get rid of that. Can you see that on your screen? This meeting is being recorded. Max?
Yes, I see it.
Can I get rid of it?
Just click.
I think you could just click OK.
Yeah.
Hang on a second. Okay, good. Are we all right now? Yeah, go on. Yeah, so this reminds me of something that happened in 1996 when we were holding at the University of East Anglia something that was called the Paleomagnetic Powwow. It was a 2-day meeting. And at that meeting, more technical problems. Hang on a second. We had a final Quo Vadis session, traditional Quo Vadis session. And again, I made the suggestion that we added environmental magnetic into future meetings title. So it becomes the Paleomagnetic and Environmental Magnetic Powwow. And at that stage, somebody who should remain anonymous, but a senior figure in British paleomagnetism, said that, well, we don't want to jump onto that environmental bandwagon. And I'd never really thought about the origin of the phrase bandwagon, but lo, this is what a bandwagon actually is and was. And so it's quite interesting because the meeting was actually being hosted by the University of East Anglia's School of Environmental Sciences. So bandwagon, I just thought we'd have a quick look at that. The bandwagon effect, it's the tendency people have to adopt a certain behavior, style or attitude just because everyone else is doing it. The more people that adopt that trend, the more likely others will hop on that bandwagon. And of course, whilst the bandwagon effect can be powerful and actually lead to formation of new trends, these behaviors can be somewhat fragile. So people tend to jump on the bandwagon quickly, but also jump off it very quickly as well, perhaps explaining why trends often tend to be so fleeting. Now, the British Geophysical Association, which this sounds a bit rude, not known as a centre for bandwagonry, but anyway, it's not meant to be rude. They themselves, when they talk about the future being bright for geophysics, you'll see amongst the blurb here that they draw attention to how important geophysics is in playing a central role in environmental issues, and that geophysicists with a broad range of backgrounds will be needed to explore and address a wide range of research topics and contemporary scientific issues. So rather than thinking about a bonanza, no, not that sort of bonanza, this sort of bonanza, this is where I think environmental magnetism is currently. I think we have an exceptionally large and rich resource that we can be mining in order to answer really important questions. So I'm going to apologize because I'm going to race you through. In fact, if the bonanza music was playing, for those of you old enough to remember it, we're going to have that excited gallop through some environmental magnetic questions and answers, because it's my feeling that, because we find distinctive magnetic minerals and particles everywhere, they give us this super rich recording that allows us to answer really important questions. And that's whether it's to do with past and present changes in the natural environment, or, as it turns out, also in the human and built environment. So we can see the formation, the transport, the deposition, the transformation of these very distinctive magnetic minerals and particles. And that's taking place at all length scales, literally from the nano to the global. And then unfortunately in this talk, I'm really not going to have the time. I tried really hard to squeeze something in, but there isn't time. But on top of all of the scientific information we can glean, there's huge potential, untapped potential to use magnetic particles in novel and diverse ways in order to build really necessary sustainable technologies. So just to prove to you that these distinctive magnetic particles are everywhere, and in fact, these pictures I'm going to show you are all of magnetites with one exception, let's just have a quick whiz through some of the lovely magnetic particles that we've been working on through the current history of environmental magnetism. Look at this beautiful detrital titanomagnetite blown into the Chinese Loess Plateau. going to talk a little bit in this talk about Queensland river sediments. So here we have some very nice discrete magnetites, lithogenic magnetites, but also, of course, we have lots of quartz hosting as inclusions also these ferromagnetic particles. If we go to somewhere like the North Sea, the Triassic of the North Sea, we find a terrifically relic type of magnetic assemblage, and we find a lot of the magnetism in those North Sea Triassic sediments is actually down to things like these ferrine chromites. Again, we've just had a little look at some of the ferromagnetic inclusions within host silicate minerals. Of course, we have extraterrestrial supply of magnetic minerals. At low temperatures, we come to the low temperature formation of magnetic minerals, and of course, bacterial magnetite formed as magnetosomes by magnetotactic bacteria, a veritable factory of, again, these beautiful, highly distinctive magnetic magnetite and sometimes sulfide-rich particles. And here we can see what a role they play in certain aquatic environments. Here is Indian Ocean sediments. We move to one of my favorite subjects, soils, and here we have lovely pedogenic, soil-formed magnetites from some soils, modern soils in Exmoor. And here we have similar soil magnetite nanoparticles and ST particles within paleosols from the Chinese Loess Plateau. Back again to some modern soils from Exmoor. I did say there'd be one gregite example, and here it is. Gorgeous formation of gregite crystals within tropical mangroves off the northeast Queensland coast. And here before your very eyes, we can see diagenesis going on with dissolution of some of these lithogenic magnetites and formation of new diagenetic products. Let's go back to high temperatures. Anthropogenic stuff. So combustion-derived magnetic spherules and nanospheres. So again, if anybody's walking through the urban environment, you'll be breathing these particles in through your nose, down into your lungs, probably up into your brain. This is a picture of a soil just next to a roadside in Liverpool. And again, you can see as many soil particles are matched by these combustion derived particles. And again, a roadside leaf acting as a very nice background and filter for those anthropogenic spherules. You can see the little asterisks whizzing around there, hopefully. Okay, and then I am going to try and talk at the end of this session about our work on these magnetic particles occurring in human tissues. Bruce referred to the birth of environmental magnetism. So I had the serendipitous good luck to be coming through Liverpool University Geography Department when Frank Oldfield was doyen of environmental work there. And between them, Frank and Roy Thompson in Edinburgh, plus we would have to mention the instrumental development by Jeff Bartington and Lindsay Molyneux, led to a whole school of undergraduate students, postgraduate students, postdocs, working away on environmental magnetism. And this sort of scheme that I've shown here on the slide, this was what was sort of floating about when I became first an undergraduate student and then a postgraduate student and came under Frank's mentorship. So this was the sort of scheme, and it was this area, modern soils, that my postgraduate work focused on. And of course, environmental magnetism, Frank and Roy's book, came out in 1996. No, 1986, sorry, 1986. So, I mean, in a nutshell, when I was working on these modern soils, it became very clear, very quickly, that the magnetic properties of soils, well, they form a very faithful and sensitive record of soil forming conditions. And that's especially in the case of redox activity, pH, and organic matter supply. So every soil that you look at, its magnetic signature will reflect faithfully those soil forming conditions. So of course, one of the things that we found very early on is in certain types of well-drained, well-buffered soils, these soils were actively forming pedogenic magnetite. And again, this beautifully distinctive SDSP material that gives rise to these really distinctive magnetic properties, high magnetic susceptibility, high frequency dependence, high ARM, rather low rather soft magnetic behavior, low MDFs, etc. Now, of course, we found that for modern soils, but obviously then I went on to look at those properties as they were recorded in paleosols. So the point of taking you through that fast tour of magnetic minerals and carrying in the environment, the point is, if those magnetic particle sources are distinctive, we can actually use them to answer key questions. And when I talk about key questions, I'm actually talking up to grand challenge scale questions. Just by tracing their formation, their transport, their deposition, and or their transformation through diagenesis, for example, trace those particles as they move and develop through the environment, and we can trace their movement and development either at geological timescales or contemporary timescales, and finally we can trace them at all length scales from the local to the global. Now, to answer those questions up to grand challenge scale, it's clearly the case that we have to rely on an ongoing development of analytical tools, which are not just magnetic, and ongoing development of interactions with the appropriate collaborating scientists, and again, not just magnetic. Okay, I'm going to race you through these various examples. If we run out of time, I'll try and shorten it as we go through. So I'm going to start with the first example. We're going to start a local scale example, lake scale sediment sourcing. And for environmental managers, for sustainability, for biodiversity, if you have lakes affected by accelerated erosion, you really need to know where is that excess sediment coming from. And so the example I'm going to talk about is Bassenthwaite Lake in the English Lake District. It's a site of special scientific interest. One of the main reasons for that is it has a very rare population, in fact, a vanishingly rare population of a fish, an Arctic char fish called Vendace. And the reason the fish is vanishingly rare is because the lake is silting up with fine sediment, which leads to the spawning of the fish. It lays its eggs in the gravels of the lake bed. The spawning of the fish is becoming unsuccessful. So everybody wants to know, where is the problem sediment coming from around the Bassenthwaite catchment? And just to give you a flavour, this is the Bassenthwaite Lake is just on the left-hand side of the photograph, and you can see some of the Northern Lake District fells and valleys that surround this lake. Somewhere from here, we have too much fine-grained sediment coming in to Lake Bassenthwaite. Critical here is to use particle size specific magnetic fingerprinting. And the reason for that is because obviously particle size varies, the magnetic properties of those different particle size fractions also varies. So what we did here, this is Rob Hatfield's project, we used a range of different magnetic measurements to fingerprint the silt-sized sediments coming into Bassenthwaite by each of the rivers flowing into that lake. We check which of the river inflows matches the silt-sized lake sediment magnetic fingerprint. And finally, always a good idea is to use an independent test of your matched magnetic fingerprint. And here we use the lead content of the river inflows and of the lake sediment. Okay, so this slide just reinforces this thing that the particle size of all your materials, your soils, your river sediments, your lake sediments, as it varies, their magnetic properties are also varying, and that's why you have to deconvolve your signal and actually look at individual particle size fractions. Okay, here's Lake Bassenthwaite marked on a map of England, and you can see it's up in the English Lake District, and you can see the lake, the linear lake, and all of its river inflows, and everywhere you've got a circle, you've got sampling going on, and you've got lake cores along the length of the lake. So as a result of both geology and land management, you can see the soils in the catchment show lots of very nice magnetic distinctiveness and variation. So we know that we can actually look at these magnetic fingerprints as they vary across the catchment. So our lake, here's another lovely picture of Lake Bassenthwaite. The lake is receiving all these magnetic recording units from the contributing soils and thence from the river inflows before deposition on the surface of the lake floor. Okay, so you sample your river sediment, you sample your lake sediment cores, and you sample your soil. So you've got the whole suite of materials that you need to fingerprint between. So here's a little bit of information. Here we have some magnetic data, and we can see that all of the potential contributing areas compared to the core tops along Lake Bassenthwaite, you can see the core tops have no overlap at all with the magnetic properties of the Derwent River sediments to the top right, and they have some overlap with the Newlands Valley inflow and also with Chapel Beck inflow. Okay, so the Derwent we can exclude as a major source of sediment to the lake. Chapel Beck and Newlands Beck are magnetically very similar. However, Chapel Beck is right up at the northeastern corner of the lake, so it cannot be the major inflow. So we begin to narrow down on Newlands Beck. Okay, more magnetic fingerprinting. And here what we can do is we can now take the river sediments and identify which catchment soils are contributing in turn to the river sediments. And again, when we do this statistical analysis, we do some fuzzy clustering of these magnetic properties. What we find is that all of the modern sediments are totally dominated by the soils that are contributing to erosion, then being carried by rivers flowing along the Newlands Valley. Now, it's very funny, when we did this project, that name, the Newlands Valley, is just a name, but of course, the new lands within the last 200 years were opened up, they were deforested, opened up for mining and for farming. So we can see just in the last 200 years, we've got a major increase in sediment flux to the lake, and it's all coming from the Newlands Valley. And amazingly enough, we find that about 90% of the sediment, and yet only 10% of the lake water, is coming from that valley. Before that time, the sediment flux rate was much lower and principally came from the Derwent River. So the opening up, the human impacts on the Newlands Valley within the last 200 years become the principal focus, and that's what needs to be looked at to manage the catchment and to try to get this rare fish successfully breeding once more. Okay, we're going to shift up in scale, spatial scale. We're going to go to Australian scale sediment sourcing. And the key question here is, where does the sediment that is damaging the Great Barrier Reef come from? Okay, so this is a massive catchment. This catchment is about the size of Greece. And we have a problem, because if we want to know where the sediment that's depositing offshore is coming from, there's good evidence that actually iron minerals are undergoing diagenetic dissolution in the Coral Sea. So we have a potential problem of conservatism or persistence of our magnetic minerals. So yet again, we can come up with an innovative answer to that problem. So the top picture here shows the detrital iron oxide minerals that are carried in the rivers, but you can see those silicate particles, and that many of the silicate particles are carrying with them a ferromagnetic signature through these magnetic inclusions. So to make sure we can actually diagnostically trace from our catchment into the Coral Sea where diagenesis is going on, we're going to use not the magnetic signature of the iron oxides present in the river sediment. We're going to dissolve them all out so that the magnetic signature only comes from the magnetic inclusions safely protected within the host silicate minerals. Okay, so we know that we will have a persistent signal from our catchments into the Coral Sea. So that's what these magnetic data show. There's a medium sand fraction which has been treated with hydrofluoric acid to remove any discrete detrital magnetic oxides and only leave the ferromagnetic inclusions that are present within the host silicate grains. And again, you can see here in this plot that depending on location, reflecting source geology, each of these rivers, each of these confluences, the magnetic properties vary according to the source of the sediment particles. So again, through the wonders of fuzzy clustering, in fact, we can now look at all of the potential source areas, and we can see magnetically they are statistically different one from another. So that's great. We have again a pattern of distinctive magnetic potential sources, which now we can compare with the sediments that were coring from our 2 bays in the Coral Sea. And this diagram just demonstrates quite nicely how you can see very clearly that the contributing sources of sediment to the Bowling Green Bay area are very different from the contributing sources of sediment to the Upstart Bay. And in fact, we can trace much of the sediment that's deposited in the Coral Sea back to literally 1 or 2 of the major portions, sub-portions of the catchment. And those are the key areas from which the excess sediment delivery is currently going on. Okay, racing on, galloping on, Bonanza-like into the ocean scale sediment sourcing. What's our key question? The key question here is what's happening to ocean circulation patterns during past glacial and interglacial stages? And in particular, is North Atlantic deep water still forming during glacial stages? So this is work that I did with one of my modeling colleagues, Grant Bigg. So we have a combined ocean atmosphere general circulation model, and we combine that with our geological, in this case, magnetic proxy data. We're going to magnetically trace iceberg rafted debris in the North Atlantic Ocean. So here's the question that paleoceanographers are wrestling with. And the question is, at the last glacial maximum, and indeed at previous glaciations, was North Atlantic deep water still forming, or was Antarctic bottom water penetrating much further north as a result of changes in salt content and buoyancy in the surface oceans? So this is a really big question that has been wrestled with by paleoceanographers for a really big time. So here's our coupled ocean atmosphere circulation model. And the way that the ocean currents are shown in this model, the way that they're visualized, is that we seed icebergs into the ocean circulation state that this model, which is run both for the present day and for the last glacial maximum, we seed iceberg release into the ocean circulation states that were modeled. And we can see where those icebergs get transported to, i.e. they're traces of the surface currents of the ocean. When this model is run, you'll see here 2 boxes labeled NSS and SSS. When this model is run and spun up and run stably, it can fall into one of 2 contrasting states. And so one of those states, the northern sinking state, is quite similar to the present day ocean circulation with North Atlantic deep water forming. But the other alternative stable state that can run is something called the southern sinking state. And this is the state where actually North Atlantic deep water formation is very limited, and you get much more dominance and much more northward penetration by Antarctic bottom water. So the modeling suggests either of these 2 states can happen during the last glacial, during glacial stage climatic conditions. So everywhere there's a dot on this model output, that's where the icebergs are being released from. And you can see the trajectory of the icebergs being mapped in the model. The icebergs will melt and disappear from this map wherever the water is warm enough to melt them away. So this is where icebergs travel to and where they get to in the ocean state known as the northern sinking state. So the North Atlantic drift is still operating here, and it's bringing a lot of warm water up towards northwestern Europe. And so icebergs don't survive anywhere to the west of Europe or to the south of Iceland. In contrast then, this is what would happen if icebergs were released with the Southern Ocean sinking state, Antarctic bottom water becoming dominant. And you can see that the water temperatures are very different from the northern sinking state. The icebergs persist much longer, they travel much further, they loop around near to the Northwest European margins. Okay, so the modeled ocean state, in the northern sinking state, you have vigorous North Atlantic deep water formation. In the southern sinking state, all of the deep water is produced in the south. In the northern sinking state, you have very strong northeasterly North Atlantic drift. In the southern sinking state, it's rather weak and easterly. So that's a study in itself, modeling how the ocean is circulating. What can the magnetic data do? The magnetic data can be used to test these two models in order to see which is most likely to have been relevant to reality during the last glacial stage. Okay, because we can make lots of magnetic measurements quite quickly. We measure hundreds of North Atlantic surface sediment samples. We measure over 150 last glacial maximum sediment samples. Of course, we can measure potential source rocks and soils. And then we can put the whole lot into our statistical analysis in order to identify any robust associations. So iceberg rafted debris, you can see here, this is just an example from South Iceland. You can see some of my students about to throw themselves into sub-zero waters on the right-hand side. When we have iceberg rafted debris layers, of course, we can see the biogenic ooze is interrupted by lots of detrital particles coming into the sediment. Okay, so we can characterize our potential circumatlantic source areas, whether they're rocks or soils or loess. So for example, here's potential source materials characterized by susceptibility. And you can see the highest susceptibility samples are all the basalts and the granites, the lowest susceptibility in the red sandstones and in bacterial magnetite dominated areas. Frequency dependence. So now you can see the highest frequency dependence comes from soils, from African soils, Turkish soils, a bit of loess. The lowest frequency dependence, unsurprisingly, in the sandstones and the granites and the rhyolites. And a quick shift across to HRM, and you can see, of course, the red sandstones producing the very largest values of HRM. So we, again, magnetically distinctive source areas all around our Atlantic Ocean depositional zone. Okay, so this is what susceptibility looks like at the present day. And you can see a very marked sort of zonation with high susceptibility up around the northern North Atlantic and much lower susceptibility as the Saharan dust plume sets off across the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean. And we have a sort of 50 degrees north limit to iceberg rafted debris. This is what the situation was in the last glacial maximum, and you can see that we've got iceberg rafted debris moving much further south, more than 10 degrees further south during this stage. The biggest enhancement in magnetic content of the sediments is marked by this blue disk. So you can see to the west of the British Isles and heading down south to off the Northwest European margins. Present day HRM, again, you can pick out the Saharan dust plume beautifully. And at the last glacial maximum, that Saharan dust plume is in fact intensified. Okay, so when we just look at the mapped magnetic data, clearly there's distinctive spatial patterns in those data. We sort of expect that because we have distinctive sediment sources in terms of magnetic characteristics. And it's also evident that there are systematic differences between the present day and the LGM. Okay, so if we put all the magnetic data into fuzzy clustering, so the key thing here is this is just the magnetic data. There is no geographic information. There's no geographic coordinates put into the fuzzy clustering. It's just the magnetic properties of all of our sediment samples. This is the clustering that results for the present day. So you can see the geographic coherency of the particular suites of present day sediments, which are dominated, of course, by the potential source areas, which vary from one part of the North Atlantic Ocean floor to another. So that's for the present day. And if we look at the LGM, when we run the fuzzy clustering initially on the LGM samples, we actually get 3 clusters. And the reason for that is because the Saharan dust plume is very, very dramatically shown. It's magnetically extreme. The lesser scale of magnetic variation between the non-dust materials makes it hard for the clustering to separate those non-dust samples. So what we do is we take out the dust plume and rerun the clustering on everything without the dusty samples included. And then we get a much better discrimination between the non-dust dominated Atlantic sediments. Okay, so we run the cluster analysis, and now I'll just plot on a map where each of those clusters actually lies in geographic terms. And again, you can see the spatial coherency of those different clusters with their different magnetic sources during the LGM. So I'll just split those up a bit for you. So cluster 4 is principally iceberg rafted debris coming from Fennoscandinavia, plus a little bit of East Greenland, Iceland materials. And you can see one of those particular distinctive sources has made its way all the way down to about 30 degrees north. Cluster 3 and 5, this is Greenland-derived iceberg rafted debris. Cluster 6, these are samples that have relatively low detrital input, and what they have is mostly Fennoscandinavian and East Greenland sourced IRD. Last glacial maximum cluster 1, the circles across by North America, that's Laurentide-derived IRD, and you notice it doesn't get out into the middle of the Atlantic. Probably what's happening here is the icebergs are carving off the glaciers and getting stuck on the continental shelf. They just don't get out and don't get transported around in the ocean. And again, a bit of independent information about the presence of IRD in these samples. Each of the numbers here is the weight percent of particles bigger than 63 microns in size. So this is, one of the classic ways of demonstrating the presence of iceberg rafted debris in oceanic sediments. Okay, hello?
Barbara, you've got 20 minutes left.
That's brilliant, thank you very much. I bet everyone's exhausted, but keep with it, more galloping. We can take our data that we've now gathered in order to test the LGM ocean circulation model. So just to refresh your memory, the northern sinking state, North Atlantic deep water formation forming pretty much like it does today, versus the southern ocean dominated, the Antarctic bottom water dominated state. And you remember the different preservation persistence of the icebergs of Iceland. So here are all of our IRD clusters plotted on this map. And how does that compare then with those two states? It's clearly a strong match for the southern ocean sinking state, the southern sinking state, where Antarctic bottom water becomes a really key part of the global oceanic circulation. Okay. Finding that the Antarctic bottom water is so important in determining North Atlantic circulation patterns is mirrored by a beautiful paper by Thilo van Dobbeneck and colleagues that came out in Paleoceanography fairly recently, which is looking in this case at the Pacific Ocean glacial state. And again, sorry if I get any of this wrong in advance, but the principal thing here that we see in the magnetic data is very clearly we can see these dark sediment horizons in the deep Pacific Ocean that are characterized by major decreases in the magnetic content of those sediments. So on this diagram, you can see the green shaded horizons are marking these sedimentary intervals where magnetite has been comprehensively dissolved, whether that's of detrital origin, for example, from windblown dust, or from in situ formation of bacterial magnetite. So again, from that paper by van Dobbeneck and colleagues, you can see beautifully brought out these different magnetic signatures. So interglacial sediments, you can see preserve the biogenic magnetite very nicely. They preserve the dust-borne magnetic minerals very nicely. But wherever you've got those dark sediment layers, you can see A, not very much magnetic content, and B, it's progressively coarsened as, of course, the finest particles are selectively dissolved before the larger particles. So the model to account, I mean, it's very similar, isn't it, to the sap-propelled situation in the Mediterranean. So the model that that is proposed in this study is all about the deoxygenation of the bottom water of the Pacific during glacial stages. And that deoxygenation comes about through, again, the northward penetration of the oxygen-poor Antarctic bottom water up into the Pacific Ocean, into the abyssal floor of the Pacific Ocean. So during glacial stages, when that infringement of the Antarctic bottom water happens, then of course the microbial degradation going on in the upper layers of the sediment, there isn't any oxygen, so those bacteria have to then turn to iron oxides as their terminal electron acceptor, and they reduce those iron oxide minerals, starting probably with the biogenic magnetite, progressing into the dust-borne detrital ferromagnets. Okay, upon deglaciation, of course, the Antarctic bottom water retreats. There's increased oxygenation of the bottom waters of the Pacific, and there's burn down right through those surface layers of the sediment, so that then finally, as you get full into the interglacial, your ocean water and your upper layers of sediment are able to preserve, in contrast to the glacial stages, they can preserve intact the bacterially formed magnetites and the detrital aeolian material. So the thing about this study, again, its focus is ocean circulation changes on a global scale. It's very nice that, as well as the North Atlantic evidence of the increased dominance of the Antarctic bottom water during glacial stages, we also see that in the case of the deep Pacific. Why is this all important? Well, of course, we're talking about the enhanced drawdown of atmospheric carbon and storage of carbon during glaciations, which is intensifying glacial stages before some of that at least will be released at interglacial inception. And this provides clearly a mechanism to amplify the rather, puny insulation forcing that Milankovitch cycles actually produce. You have to have a major amplifier to induce that small insulation forcing to cause a big change in Earth's climate. Wow, so we're going to have another go now at two other types of information and two other big questions. I cannot not mention the behavior of the East Asian paleomonsoons. Of course, the thing about monsoons is they affect more than 50% of the world's population. So it's really, really important to be able to understand how the East Asian monsoons have evolved and indeed what might happen as we warm through greenhouse warming. So we move on to the terrestrial environment, and here we have the major agricultural asset that is the Chinese Loess Plateau. And of course, when those deposits have been incised by erosion, you can see the stratigraphy, you can see the paleosols, the orangey layers of the paleosols, and the interleaved, less weathered dust layers. And again, for scale, top right, wearing a very embarrassing pair of shorts, that is me. So the so-called buff-colored dust layers, of course, they're characterized by rather low levels of magnetic susceptibility compared to the soils, which are variably magnetically enhanced. Okay, the thing about the climate of the Chinese Loess Plateau is in the winter, high pressures centered over the land. The winter monsoon blows out towards the Pacific, and in the summer that pressure situation is reversed with low pressure over the land, high pressure over the Pacific, and southeasterly winds blowing moisture in the summer monsoon across the Loess Plateau. So that summer monsoon mechanism is reflected in the southeast to northwest gradient in modern day precipitation, as you can see in this diagram here. So the question is, how much precipitation did the East Asian monsoon bring across the Chinese Loess Plateau during glacial and interglacial stages? So beautiful diagram, marine Delta 18 plotted here in blue, and the magnetic susceptibility of a site in the central Chinese Loess Plateau, Shifeng, in red. And you can see particularly from the mid-Pleistocene transition onwards, how strongly coupled those sets of information are. Okay, so the fundamental story here is that in the less weathered loess layers, the magnetic properties of those layers are dominated by the wind-blown dust and the wind-blown detrital magnetic minerals seen in the left-hand side, whereas during the interglacial stages, particularly because there's more moisture available, those loess layers become more and more weathered, and they will form pedogenic magnetite. So the second micrograph you can see is a very nice picture showing the typical pedogenic magnetite formed in these well-drained, well-buffered Chinese paleosols. And of course, because they are always, these pedogenic magnetites are always right on the SD-SP boundary, then you can see in the right-hand diagram, that's why they give rise to these really high susceptibility, frequency-dependent susceptibility ARM values that characterize the paleosols. Okay, there's been a bit of debate. Is it magnetite? Is it magnemite? Is it somewhere in between? So Ahmed and I had a paper just fairly recently where we did a lot more work at the TEM, high resolution STEM scale, in order to answer the question, what is the mineralogy of these soil nanomagnets? Hello.
Barbara, sorry to interrupt. You've got about 10 minutes now.
Brilliant. That's great. Thank you very much. So those nanoscale magnets formed in soils, whether it's modern soils or in those Chinese paleosols, we can see from this high resolution TEM work that they're predominantly magnetite. They have been surface oxidized slightly to magnemite, but they're predominantly magnetite. And again, of course, in terms of the calibration, if you will, the primary factor controlling redox activity and the precipitation of those magnetites, the primary factor controlling that is precipitation. And hence you can produce these calibration curves between soil magnetic susceptibility and precipitation. And you see that beyond precipitation of about 1200 millimeters per year, at that point the soils become too acidic. They're not going to make as much pedogenic magnetite once you've decalcified and acidified your soils. Okay, so having that climate function established means you can, of course, then take all of the magnetic signatures of your 30, 40 odd paleosols and reconstruct mean annual precipitation for those paleosols. I could speak at length, but obviously have no time to talk about the difference between the soil magnetic records for the Chinese loess plateau compared to the oxygen isotope records of the Chinese caves. But if you're interested, I can talk to you about it another time, and I can reference some of the papers accordingly. Clearly, it's the case that you can refine your climate function, because whilst mean annual precipitation is the dominant control on the amount of magnetite formed in soils, excuse me, of course, you do have to take into account the available soil water, which is going to be affected by the amount of potential evapotranspiration. So clearly, there is more refinement on top of the fundamental loess magnetism precip story that has been and will be carried out. I'm going to apologize to Andrew Roberts if he's watching this, because that was just to say that's I'm only talking about magnetite so far, but of course there's lots of other magnetic minerals, including hematite, and I'm just going to skip over that because time is running short, and I do want to get to the nanoscale and to one of the key questions regarding air pollution and human health. So I'm going to talk to you very quickly about the pandemic. And the pandemic I'm talking about is the pandemic of neurodegenerative disease. Okay, so all of these diseases, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, motor neuron, they share characteristics. You lose neurons through oxidative stress. You start producing misfolded proteins, you have inflammation, and you lose your cognitive and motor functions. And some of the work we've been doing shows that actually you lose many of these neurons prior to actually manifesting any clinical symptoms, and this process is beginning from childhood onwards. Just as you thought you were escaping from the coronavirus pandemic, here I am to scare you and say that this is a growing neurodegenerative pandemic. The numbers are going up steadily, both in Alzheimer's and in Parkinson's. Okay, there is something in air pollution that comes from major roads that is associated statistically with an increased incidence of neurodegenerative disease. So the Lancet, January 2017, showed something like a 7 to 11% increased risk of dementia for people living within 50 meters of major roads. New study last year by Shi et al. Again demonstrates these very strong relationships between hazard ratio, increased risk of developing dementia when you have increased levels of particulate matter, especially fine-grained particulate matter, in this case less than 2.5 micrometers in aerodynamic diameter. Okay, so here's the thing. Magnetic content of air pollution strongly correlates, whether it's with PM mass or with NOx content, for example. So wherever you have particulate pollution formed by emission of combustion products or friction products, you always have magnetic material forming and co-associating in a very direct way. So when we look at air pollution in the urban atmosphere, one of the things we find ubiquitously are these magnetite nanospheres. Okay, so they are present in just about any urban roadside environment. And when we look at the magnetic content of PM from different sources, particulate matter from different sources, we find there's very large amounts of magnetic material, magnetite particularly, both in exhaust-derived particulate material and also in breakaware-derived particulate material. So why is this potentially important? So iron-rich particles, so number one, they're often the most abundant in the solid urban particulate matter mix. And iron, it's an essential element in all human tissues, and that's especially true for the brain. But iron is actually toxic when it isn't safely stored or transported or regulated. And the reason for that is because iron is involved in the Fenton reaction and causes excess formation of these very damaging reactive oxygen species, especially the hydroxyl species. So that's why iron-rich particles in air pollution are potentially of such importance for human health. Okay, one of the things that we're particularly concerned about is the nanoparticles, because they dominate particle number concentration, even though, of course, they don't dominate particle mass. Okay, so 2016, we published a paper in PNAS where we show evidence for the presence in human brains of abundant magnetite nanoparticles, which are strikingly similar to those magnetite nanospheres that we see so abundantly in roadside pollution. Until that paper was published, it was thought that all magnetite in the brain was of biogenic or in situ origin. And because iron-rich particles, especially magnetite, are toxic to brain cells, then exposure to those airborne magnetite pollution nanoparticles might be a risk factor for neurodegenerative disease. So a quick flip through the electron microscopy. So you see these very distinctive opaque spherical particles. On the right-hand side, you can see what looks very like the sort of biogenic magnetites reported by Joe Kirschvink and colleagues since 1992. On the left-hand side, you see these rather dissimilar spherical nanoparticles. We find them abundantly in brains, and by spectroscopy, we can identify that much of this is magnetite. We can look at the elemental concentrations and compositions using energy dispersive X-ray analysis. And again, you can see it's not just iron, there's titanium, there's aluminium. So this co-association of metals, including metals that have no physiological role, they should not be present in the brain, but we find them often together with these magnetite particles. X-ray analysis here demonstrating the presence of platinum of cobalt, of nickel, again, things that have no role, should not naturally be in the brain. So we find these iron and co-associated metal-rich air pollution nanoparticles. They're everywhere, so they can evade all bodily defenses, as well as in the brain. We found them in the heart, we found them in the placenta. We've got other groups around the world now looking at them and finding them in the bloodstream, in lung effusions. So we found them first in the frontal cortex. We've subsequently found these particles in the brain stem. Liu et al., working on Beijing residents, have found them in the bloodstream and in the lungs, in the lung effusions. Here we find them in the mitochondria of the human heart. We found these titanium-rich nanoparticles in the neuroenteric system. And again, we found them in the placenta of pregnant women. Okay, so in these particles that are being found and reported in human tissues, iron is the most common, along with all of these other types of metal species I've mentioned. And that is a reflection of what we find in air pollution, where generally iron is the most common. Okay, so I tried this on some people before. Which one of these is a brain magnetite particle and which one is a pollution magnetite particle? The takeaway being that they all look very similar. Plaques and tangles in the brain contain, they are sites of metal accumulation. AD brains in certain regions contain more iron than normal brains, and magnetite particles, as you see here, have been found directly associated with AD plaques. And again, evidence of loss of neurons, loss of normal brain tissue, formation of these plaques, directly associated with the presence of these metal nanoparticles in the tissues. Okay, I'm not suggesting that iron-rich air pollution nanoparticles are the only risk factor for health impact, but it's got special properties which make it a really strong contender. They're ultrafine in size. Magnetite and iron particles have specific brain toxicity. They're ubiquitous within the airborne particulate matter mix. So on that basis, we might have found something that might be a significant environmental risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And of course, if that's the case, you can expect to find increased incidence where you have high magnetite exposure from some occupational settings. You might find high exposure indoors, of course, if you have open fires, and outdoors from vehicle and or industrial PM sources. Let's move on swiftly. Cancer as well, my God, let's move on. Conclusions. The environmental magnetism bonanza, in my view, remains an absolutely super rich resource with intensive mining still required. It's clear to me that not only is there substantial scope to collaborate with other scientists, but there's a need to collaborate with other scientists in order to address really pressing environmental issues. And of course, we're working at the nanoscale in many contexts, so we need that ongoing development of high resolution instrumental advances in order to integrate our magnetic observations and measurements with nanoscale observations and analyses. And you'll be glad that I've run out of time, because otherwise I would have tried to talk about these applications, and clearly that's for another day. So to finish, that was the diagram when I started. I think we can make some substantive additions to this diagram in these sorts of ways. And on that note, thank you very much for your applications. On that note, thank you very much for your time and attention as I galloped you with the Bonanza music ringing in your ears. As always, very much appreciated.
Okay, thank you very much, Barbara. So I think we're going to be open to questions now for about 10 minutes or so. And I see that Win has raised his hand. Go ahead, Win.
Hi. Great talk, Barbara. Really entertaining, and a lot of stuff as usual. Some probably questions you'll think, what on earth is he asking? One of the things was that these spherical particles were mostly derived, or the biggest percentage was from disk breaks. that was correct, wasn't it? I think in one of your diagrams I saw.
Say it again, Wynne. It was what, sorry?
The spherical magnetites are mostly derived, or in the pollution studies, from disk breaks. Or disk breaks?
Yes and no. No. So the spherical shape really reflects high temperature of formation. So these things are actually being released essentially as droplets, or sort of semi-volatiles, and then as they get released, whether it's from the friction coupling breakware or from the exhaust, they get released into the air, and then of course they cool, but they tend to keep, not always, but they can keep that near spherical shape. So the spherical particles really reflect that high temperature formation at their source.
Okay. All right. So that wasn't the answer I wanted. It was the answer to a different question I was going to ask you, which is why they're spherical. But so the disc breaks, because I thought that increasingly cars are using these ceramic composites rather than cast iron discs. Right? I just wondered if that was something that would be a major benefit in future cars, not to use cast iron disc brakes.
Yeah. I mean, the brake story is interesting, isn't it? So humankind has this repeating pattern. So let's put asbestos in brake pads, and then we find that's not a great idea. Okay, so let's put lots of iron in brake pads. So actually, many commercially available brake pads at the moment, Wynne, have up to 30% by volume magnetic powder in order to act as a lubricant and a filler. It's cheap. So many brake pads at the moment actually have added magnetite. So I think this is one of the reasons at the moment brake pad emissions produce, some of the most concentrated magnetic powder at the roadside. It's amazing. As well as changing the composition of brake pads, electrification of the vehicle fleet is going to be important, because whilst electric vehicles are heavier than normal vehicles because of the battery, they don't brake nearly so often, and most of the braking is regenerative braking rather than frictional braking. So actually, electrification of the fleet is going to be a good thing in terms of reducing iron-rich particulate pollution.
So one last question, if I may, is there any way to distinguish these spherical particles from, say, octahedral particles or other shapes simply from magnetic measurements? I mean, you showed some very nice TEM work or SEM work, but are there any quick methods magnetically which you can use to detect these?
I don't know. It would be nice if there was. I mean, this is exactly it, Wynne. At the moment we've got a bit of a gap between magnetic measurements of bulk tissue, and then we zoom in with high resolution STEM down to the nanoscale. I've been talking to Roger Fu, we've got to start to bridge between those two scales of analysis in order to, because obviously when you're doing high resolution TEM, you're limited obviously to the number of samples, the number of cells, the number of particles that you can analyze. So for me, that's one of the frontiers. If we can find ways of bridging that analytical gap between the bulk magnetic measurement and the electron microscope analysis, that would be a tremendous step forward in all of this health-related work.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Barbara.
Thanks, Wynne.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions. So we have one from Gunter Kletechka. He says, "Great talk. Can you please show the pathways, both ocean and air, how the sources of magnetite particles cross from southern to northern hemisphere and vice versa?"
Just can I read that? That's quite a long question and I've lost track. How did the particles in water and air get from southern to northern hemisphere? Was that it? So
southern to northern hemisphere, yeah.
Yeah, so not a lot of dust blows from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere. Some does, but mostly it's within hemisphere dust transport. Certainly, ocean currents can carry, as everybody knows, can carry magnetic particles. I don't know. I haven't really got a grasp of the fundamental nature of this question, Gunther. If you could clarify for me.
Hi, great talk, Barbara.
Hi, Gunther.
Yeah, I really like your talk and how you handle it, and you were talking a lot about the origin of the magnetic particles, and that it looks like that there must be a way that some particles from southern hemisphere cross to the northern and vice versa, and it's not clear to me how well this could be done. It appears that maybe ocean current, like this low bottom ocean current, can do the job. And my understanding was that in terms of the atmosphere, that atmospheric currents rarely cross this like equator, that they don't come, they don't the masses. But I want to make sure, what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, no, as I mentioned, there's not a lot of dust transport between the hemispheres. Most of the material I was talking about doesn't reflect transport from north to south or south to north. Mostly talking about, so for example, around the North Atlantic, obviously most of the sediments coming into the North Atlantic are coming from that peri-Atlantic region with all of those distinctive geologies.
Thank you. That's all. I just
mostly you're looking at zonal sources and zonal pathways of transport, not interhemispheric transport. I definitely agree with that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, Richard Harrison has a question which is just FMR ?
Now that was just a comment to the previous discussion that Wynne was asking if you could distinguish spheres from octahedra. I guess I just didn't know whether ferromagnetic resonance was a way. That was just, anyway. But I had a different question, which was going back to the air pollution. I think the most interesting aspect of that for me is the fact that the iron is really critical as a part of the process. So you're not just using magnetism as a proxy for something. Actually, the fact that the iron itself is really. So I was wondering, because I'm not a biologist, if you could expand a little on the term oxidative stress and what that does, and does the source of the iron matter in that process? Whether it's iron in magnetite or iron in some other mineral or iron that's associated with other elements. Sort of just expand on that a little bit.
Well, again, Rich, it's a really good question because we're frontier stuff. But so the brain needs a lot of iron to work. So iron is essential to most enzymes. It's essential to mitochondrial activity. So there's a lot of iron in the brain. But actually, iron is a really double-edged sword, because if any of it is let free, either within a cell or able to cross the blood-brain barrier, for example, if that's not controlled, it will actually interact to produce oxidative stress through the Fenton reaction. So those reactive oxygen species are produced through the effects of free iron. One of the things that we have absolutely no idea about is when you have iron that's in the brain that shouldn't be there, it's likely that some of it will be dissolved. That will be one of the defense mechanisms. Okay, so you'll get an endocytosis, you'll get a very acidic sub-environment within that area of the cell, and it'll dissolve the iron, which is good, except you'll have a period of time when you've got free ions available, which, if there's many of them, and or if it's chronic, it's repeated and repeated, can cause those sorts of reactions and the formation of those reactive oxygen species, and also some inflammation. So somebody said to me, oh, well, if magnetite's important in Alzheimer's disease, then obviously there should be a direct correlation. More magnetite equals worse Alzheimer's disease. It's not at all clear, because if you have the ability to dissolve the excess iron, then you won't see any such correlation. And it may be that if your genetic coding makes you very efficient at dissolving iron, actually maybe that's a bad thing in terms of neurodegeneration, because your iron supply keeps on coming in, keeps on coming in, keeps on coming in. So it's not straightforward, as you'd expect. It's also probably not just iron, but whenever we see iron in air pollution, whenever we see iron in human tissues, there's always these other transition metals. So there's always copper, well, not always, but often copper, There's other things like titanium, there's aluminium. So it probably isn't just the magnetite, but it's what, like I said, the very fact that magnetite is found sitting directly inside plaques, the fact that it can catalyze, formation of the ROS. It interacts with the amyloid proteins, and it enhances the rate of misfolding of the amyloid proteins. It's all circumstantial at present until there's more cytotoxicity testing of the sorts of particles that we see in the air pollution. But it's strongly circumstantial. It would be hard to imagine that repeatedly breathing in lots of ultrafine magnetite and other associated species could be good for your health.
Thanks.
Okay, we have another question from Mike Falk, who's asking, are the negative effects of magnetite particles in the brain similar to those of other ion storage disorders? Would you expect studying those would be useful to understanding?
Yes, and yes. So particularly when we looked at the heart, all right, so there's a heart condition known as Friedreich's ataxia, and this is a genetic condition where people they mishandle ion storage as a result of the lack of a certain gene. And that means that iron accumulates in the myocardium of the heart. And so the sort of cascade of inflammation and reactive stress, oxidative stress produced by the reactive oxygen species, the sort of thing that you see in Friedreich's ataxia, I think is a very good model for what happens when people are exposed to a lot of airborne magnetic pollution and iron-rich pollution. So, I went to a meeting a couple of years ago that was all of the Alzheimer's people, and they shifted their focus away from amyloid protein misfolding to iron and the destruction of cells by a process called ferroptosis, so iron-induced destruction of cells. They made that shift in focus probably about 10 years ago. So the neurodegenerative people are really, really worried about iron mishandling in neurodegenerative disease. So when I stood up and said, well, what would you say if you were, fairly repeatedly exposed to iron-rich nanoparticles on a day in, day out basis? Then they were, horrified. So they were already worried about the mishandling of iron that's naturally in the brain, and then throw in at least the possibility that you're exposed frequently to airborne ultrafine magnetite, which we have shown can get into any major organ, and then yeah, it's a worry.
Okay, I think we're just going to have one last question. Josh, do you want to speak your question or me to read it?
I can speak it. Again, great talk, Barbara. I had a question about some of the magnetic sourcing work that was being done, where it seemed like the approach at the time was to physically separate out a particular grain size fraction. It could be fine sand, it could be silt-sized particles, and then do further work on that. And what I was wondering is, do you see a role for unmixing techniques, whether it's remnant unmixing or fork unmixing of some kind, to try and get a more holistic view of all of the magnetic behaviors in a sediment, rather than physically disaggregating them in order to do some of this sourcing work?
I like the physical disaggregation because you're not going to introduce any artifact in your mathematical deconvolution. So I must admit I like the physical disaggregation and actually separating those different fractions. And it's quite interesting because, again, if you look at sort of related but different work, if you look at the people looking at the isotopic signatures in the ice in Vostok or other ice cores, they started off just bulk measurements of isotopic composition, and then they realized that actually it wasn't discriminatory enough, and they actually had to split out the different particle size fractions in order to do the matching with the potential source areas. So you can always try some overall quicker magnetic measurement and unmixing. Don't see why not. But my gut feeling is that you get a much clearer picture if you actually do the particle size separations.
Thanks.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. So just one second, I'll find Nick. This is from Hassan Sheikh, who says, "Thank you for your amazing talk, Barbara. When you say we see these spherical particles in bloodstreams, tissues, parentheses, and we cannot differentiate where they are related to combustion or break abrasion, end parentheses, how can we attribute them to either sources?"
So, I mean, the thing about these particles is it's the whole package, you know, the morphology, the size, the composition, the co-association with other non-physiological metals. You see those in somebody's bloodstream and you think there is only one source of that, and that's air pollution. You know, I think it's pretty clear. They're so similar. I mean, I think the Chinese group in Beijing, I think they also looked at isotopic compositions of those particles and also did a match between air pollution particles and what they observed in the lung effusions and in the bloodstream. And again, it was a strong match there as well. So, you know, if these particles can get into the lungs, if they can get into the bloodstream, if they can go up the axons of your olfactory nerve, or the axons of your neuroenteric nerves, you know, there's nowhere they can't go. If you know, the reverse case would be, you know, show me a person who lives in an urban environment who doesn't have these particles in their system. That's, you know, that's where we're at with it, because I can't see how you can avoid either inhaling or ingesting them one way or another.
Thank you. Actually, the thing I was trying to ask was that if, for example, if we have one of these set as control, if we have like electric vehicles and there's no vehicle combustion, because both of them are related to high temperature, like you said, are formed by, the morphology is formed by high temperature, you know, combustion. So basically, my question was like, if both of them are like spherical in nature, and do we have a way to quantify whether it's more coming from the brake pads or more from the vehicle, the gas combustion, basically?
Oh yeah, so that work. One of my students has been doing exactly that. So he's been quantifying. He's been apportioning the magnetite particles that we see at roadside dust. And at the moment, the magnetic particles are dominant at the roadside. They're dominantly sourced from breakwear rather than from exhaust emissions. But you know, this is all about the roadside stuff. But you know, you mustn't forget all the other stuff that's coming from industrial sources, from electricity generation plants, coal burning. You know, I mean, most people will probably get their biggest dose through their daily commute, unless you live, you know, within sneezing distance of a steel processing plant, or I say a power generation plant, or whatever. So I've talked a lot about the roadside stuff. Lancaster, for example, doesn't have a lot of industry, but it has a lot of traffic. So you know, the roadside sources are important, but also, of course, there are, in any environment, there's going to be potentially wider range sources as well. And that's the thing, you know, there needs to be more work done to actually characterize the properties of all the magnetic particles coming from those different sources. So we had a paper just recently, we were looking at incidents of cognitive impairment in Irish people. So Irish people who spend a lot of time with open fires burning in the living room compared to many other European nations. So again, we predicted they would be exposed to greater quantities of iron-rich pollution and show increased cognitive impairment, and that's the case. So it's terrible, but you know, it's terrible, but it's good. We can predict based on what we're finding which groups should be showing evidence of increased neurodegenerative impacts and or cardiovascular impacts. So those hypotheses now are there. People can go away and test them.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. I think we'll just keep going because it's an interesting discussion. So I think Bruce Moskowitz has a question.
Hi, Barbara. Great
Hi, Bruce.
talk. I have a question. Maybe this is a little off to the side.
Yeah.
So going back to our traffic roadside dust, have you looked into or aware of any correlations between magnetic pollution and microplastics?
No, I haven't come across any. And yes, other people are now thinking about it. I mean, I think it's really interesting with the microplastics because they're micro, not nano. So people have grasped that problem really quickly because I think, you know, it is relatively easy, to see it. You know, people can demonstrate its presence much more easily. Are you thinking there might be some sort of association between magnetite and the microplastics?
Oh, well, I guess I was thinking about, you know, this using, you know, magnetite as a proxy for toxic metals in urban pollution.
Yeah.
Whether that might, you know, I was thinking of microplastics being derived from tire wear on vehicles in one instance.
Yeah. So you know, the organic side of things is hard to analyze in high resolution EM work, for example. But we know in the breakaway emissions, because there's often a resin that is used to bind the particles in the brake pad formulation. So we know that there's a lot of organic particulate being generated from that resin. So again, there may be some co-association. It is something up for grabs in that frontier.
Thanks.
Okay, we have a question from Hannah Grisson. She says 95/5,000 translation results. How did you obtain tissue samples? You also have information about the age of patients, their exact diagnosis, etc.
Yeah. Okay, so getting hold of human tissue samples isn't very easy. It's governed, as you might expect, by a lot of very rigorous ethical guidelines, and you know, you need an in. So one of the major ways we had an in was that my biomedical colleagues were already working on Alzheimer's disease. So I had access, therefore, to Manchester Brain Bank. Now, there's a big problem with and so they're fresh frozen samples. So there's no storage of those samples in formaldehyde. They're all fresh frozen. One of the big problems with using samples that only come from a brain bank is that the great majority of those samples come from self-selecting subjects. So somebody thought when they were alive, I'm going to leave my brain to science. In general, those people are of a certain socioeconomic status and normally pretty old, actually, when they die. And so one of the things that's become apparent to us is by looking at much younger subjects, you realize that this damage is starting to happen very, very early. So decades before you actually see the clinical symptoms being manifest, the impacts are already starting very early. So if you want to see a relationship between exposure to this type of metal-rich particulate pollution and disease, the subjects you need to be looking at are much, much, much younger than the subjects you tend to have available to you in brain bank samples. So that all raises very interesting questions about where can you get young subjects. And then another huge question, it's one of the frontiers for me, it comes back to that idea, for goodness sake, why do we have to wait till they're dead? Can't we actually start to develop the instrumentation, the approaches that means we can start to do this work on living subjects. So for me, that is just a huge opportunity that we really should be turning our collective minds to.
Okay, thank you very much, Barbara. Are there any other last-minute questions? Raise your hands if so.
So Wynne wants to know, should he cycle to work through traffic or drive quickly to work and generate more pollution? You should cycle to work along the meadows, Wynne.
Along the meadows, yeah. I'm living the opposite end of town, unfortunately, but yeah.
So you should ask your city council to start implementing green screening measures so that the pollution is at least mitigated before we all move to e-vehicles.
Absolutely, thank you.
Yeah.
And when and wear a mask.
And wear a mask, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. And actually, if you cycle really hard, Wynne, it's better because then you'll be panting through your mouth as opposed to breathing it all in through your nose and going straight into your brain.
I'll bear that in mind as well.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Yeah, we're about 15 minutes behind schedule, but I think we all need a break. So we'll break now for 15 minutes and reconvene at 1/4 to the hour. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.